In part one, we looked at respiration in fish, and in part two, we're going to look at respiration in amphibians, in reptiles, and in mammals. And so let's start with amphibians. One thing that we see in this picture are the internal gills and the external gills. This is a tiger salamander, or ambystoma. And salamander larvae, in other words, very young salamanders, that is, have both internal and external gills. Now, what's going to happen is that we're going to see that the internal gills are lost, and the external gills, these feathery gills on the outside, are the ones that remain in the juveniles. And then metamorphosis typically takes place to where they will lose the external gills as well. But in some cases, we have neotenic salamanders that retain their juvenile characteristics, and in those cases, those feathery external gills remain. Through metamorphosis, lungs will also develop in amphibians. And so amphibians will have lungs internally, and so there will be respiration at the lungs as well as respiration of the gills. And so regarding the gills, the way that they are going to grab the oxygen and release the CO2 is through water currents. This water is going to have oxygen in it, and these gills are filled with capillaries. So these capillaries will extract the oxygen and release the CO2. Once this amphibian undergoes metamorphosis and loses the external gills, we have to be able to talk about how air can be brought to the lungs. And this is going to be a similar mechanism to what we saw with fish. There are two ways that this can happen. And one way is called the two-stroke buccal pump. So it's called a buccal pump because it is the musculature around the mouth, and this musculature around the mouth can make the buccal cavity larger or smaller. And so the two-stroke mechanism, which is depicted here in ambystoma, is where in the first phase we have expansion of the buccal cavity. And again, this is the musculature that's going to be around the face area. And that expansion is going to do two things. It's going to take expired air from the lungs and bring it into the buccal cavity. Simultaneously, the fresh air from the atmosphere will also come into the buccal cavity. These two will mix inside the buccal cavity. And then secondly, in the second phase, you have a compression phase where the musculature compresses the buccal cavity. And then again, two things happen. Some of that air gets pushed to the lungs, and some of that air gets pushed out to the atmosphere. So just realize that in a two-stroke mechanism, we are a bit more efficient in that we have fewer steps compared to the four-stroke, which we're going to see in a little bit. But the air is definitely mixing. And so let's see what a four-stroke buccal pump can do for us, for example, in Amphiuma. So the first thing that happens is an expansion phase of the buccal cavity. But what this does is that it brings air from the lungs into the mouth, and this is the expired air. So expired air is going to be richer in CO2 and lower in oxygen. So this expired air goes into the buccal cavity, into the mouth, In the second phase, we have a compression, and this compression, again, from those muscles around the face and the mouth, will compress the buccal cavity, and that compression is going to push that expired air out. So now basically we have a buccal cavity that is rather empty of air. In the third phase, we have second expansion, and this expansion now is going to bring fresh air in. So this atmospheric air is rich in oxygen. It'll go into the buccal cavity. This expansion is from that musculature around the face, and that's why we call it the buccal pump. And then the fourth phase is a second compression. But in this case, that second compression is going to take that fresh air in the buccal cavity and push that fresh air to the lungs. And so this is very similar to what we saw in air-breathing fish. And so amphibians clearly have retained this mechanism of the buccal pump from their fish ancestors. We want to look at the metamorphosis of a frog here. And of course, we start with our embryo, and then we have this tadpole in the early stages. And what we notice with these tadpoles are external gills, which means that these tadpoles are going to use those water currents to oxygenate those capillaries in those external gills. And then over here what we see is that the tadpoles will attach themselves to a substrate using a type of suction of that buccal cavity. And usually tadpoles are going to be vegetarian at this time. They'll be eating plant material and just scraping it. But that suction that they use is to avoid getting swept away by those water currents when they're so tiny. The next thing that's going to happen is that what we're going to see is this operculum develops. And this operculum starts to cover those external gills. So they're still there, but you can't really see them. They are getting smaller, of course, because we are undergoing metamorphosis, but they're under the operculum. And once the limbs start to bud out, around that time, internally, what we're going to see is that the tadpole will start developing lungs and will start breaching the surface of the water from time to time to take some gulps of atmospheric air and inflate those lungs. The gills are atrophying more and more as this goes on. That tail, that caudal tail, will start getting smaller and smaller, and basically what is going to happen is apoptosis of the cells within that tail until that tail basically starts to disappear, and these limbs get larger and larger. Now, by the time we're an adult frog, we are breathing atmospheric air. That's how adult frogs are going to be breathing. So let's look at the anatomy of these tadpoles. Again, what we're going to be using are the buccal, but in this case also we're going to see pharyngeal. In other words, the throat area is also going to be important to create a pumping mechanism. So we'll see the pumping mechanism developing further down in the animal. And what we're going to see is that in reptiles, it's going to develop even further down. into the trunk of the animal. And so we have both buccal and pharyngeal. We can see that we'll have a musculature that will allow for that pumping mechanism to basically expand and compress those cavities in there. And here what we can see is that ability of that oral sucker using those compressions to basically create suction onto the substrate of a plant. And this is important because as the stream flows over the tadpole, that suction allows for that tadpole not to get swept away. Now, the reason why this is important for the breathing of the tadpole is because the suction is coming from the mouth, and therefore the mouth is not available for breathing any longer regarding the internal gills. And so what's going to happen is that the nares is going to open. That nares is available for water to flow through it, go into the buccal cavity, and then behind that buccal cavity is going to be the internal gill curtain, and water can flow through that gill curtain, similarly to how we saw with fish, and out through the outlet in a unidirectional mechanism. Here what we see is the view from the front, where we see that the suction brings the mouth down towards the substrate. And here what we see is that even though the mouth is unavailable for water flow, the nares are available, and those are going to be the entry points for the water to flow into the buccal cavity and over the gill curtain. And again, the musculature and the skeleton that is doing this for the frog, I don't want you to worry about the individual names of these bones and muscles, but just realize that it's a very specialized anatomy in order to be able to do this mechanism. Looking at adult frog respiration, we see that it resembles that of lungfish, except that the air is entering and leaving through the nares or the nose. What happens is that the pharynx floor lowers itself, drawing fresh air through the nasal cavities into the buccal cavity. So here we're using the lowering of the pharynx or the throat to basically expand the buccal cavity and therefore decrease the pressure in the buccal cavity, forcing air to go in through the nares. Now, that fresh air is going to get stored in the floor of the buccal cavity. In the second step, what we're going to see is that the thorax is going to compress from the musculature around the thorax, and this is going to push the air from the lung towards the buccal cavity, but this air is going to stream itself over the stored fresh air and exit the nares. And so what you need to imagine here is that you have this stored fresh air in the floor of the buccal cavity, and the expired air is streaming over it. The next thing that's going to happen is that we are going to close the nares and we are going to compress the buccal cavity and expand the thoracic cavity in order to force the fresh air to go into the lung. At this point, we have almost finished the cycle. All we have to do is close the glottis in order to keep that air in there. There's the closed glottis, and open up the nares in order to get ready to do this all over again. As part of their reproductive behavior, frogs have developed vocal cords in order to make frog sounds. Now, both males and females are going to have vocal cords, which you can see here in this picture. And you can see that these vocal cords are being controlled by the musculatures around the cartilage that can be in an open position or in a closed position. Even though both males and females are going to have vocal cords, only males are going to have resonating vocal sacs. And these vocal sacs comprise a third compartment. We talked about the buccal cavity and the thoracic cavity where the lungs are, but now we have yet a third compartment. So this is going to be right below the buccal cavity, or off the floor of the buccal cavity. And the way that it works is that air is forcefully shifted back and forth between the lungs and the vocal sac. And so we can see that the arrow can go this way and basically bounce off the vocal sac like a drum and then get shifted back into the lung that way. Now, for this to be successful, the nares are closed in order to prevent the air from escaping. Now, these are the sounds that you hear in the spring when reproduction in frogs is especially going to be more common. And this is clearly a reproductive behavior, especially for male frogs, to call upon female frogs for reproductive purposes. Amphibians in general are famous for cutaneous respiration, which means respiration through their skin. Their skin is typically going to be moist and is going to be thin compared to, for example, the skin of reptiles. Reptiles are not going to be able to breathe through their skin as well because their skin is going to be much more keratinized and much thicker. And so there's so many different varieties of amphibians and their adaptations for being able to breathe through their skin. And so here are two interesting examples. One is known as the Titicaca water frog. And what we see here are these skin folds that increase the surface area of this frog. And because of those skin folds, this frog is also nicknamed the scrotum water frog. On the right, we see that, again, we have a mechanism for increasing the surface area. And what we see is the hairy frog. And this one has basically put finger-like papillae, similar to those external gills that we saw in salamanders in a sense. And you can really see how red they are in this picture. And those are going to be basically capillary beds with a lot of surface area to allow for the frog to breathe through those hairs. Here is a image that shows us how far cutaneous respiration can go. And what we see is at the bottom is a scale of the percent of total gas exchange. And we can see that the black bar is for oxygen uptake and the gray bar is for carbon dioxide excretion. And it'll be noticed that these will vary. And when you look at a human, for example, up at the top, humans are basically doing almost no gas exchange through their skin, although a little bit is happening, but that's not at all their primary purpose. We see that, of course, as we move down, we have all sorts of different types of respirations that can take place. And in some cases, you might see that in some snakes, for example, the skin or cutaneous membrane may be important for carbon dioxide excretion, but not so much for oxygen uptake. And if you look further down, you'll see that especially as we get to amphibians, what we notice is a very high increase in especially oxygen uptake through the cutaneous membrane. You can see that these black bars here show us that a lot of oxygen uptake has taken place through the skin, and the gills are still there and they're going to be more important for carbon dioxide excretion. And that's why you don't see that gray bar being as big for a lot of these amphibians, is because the gills are the ones that are excreting most of the carbon dioxide, but it's the skin that's actually absorbing most of the oxygen. Now, this is a huge spectrum, and so we can go all the way actually to 100%. And there are some amphibians, like the lungless salamander, they don't have lungs at all, and they are breathing 100% through their skin, which is quite amazing and pretty surprising that a species of salamander would actually lose their lungs entirely and not have them at all, so that the skin is 100% the breathing organ. Makes you think about breathing in a very different way. Here we want to look at the respiration that takes place inside eggs. And let's review what an amniote is versus an anamniote. So an anamniote is a type of animal that doesn't develop in amniotic fluid. And basically these fluids develop within these membranes that surround the embryo. So anamniotes don't have as many membranes, and so they don't have as many layers of fluid around them. This allows them, however, to respirate directly between the surrounding environment and the embryo across the skin. And so basically in a jelly type of egg, the gases can diffuse through that and go directly to oxygenate the embryo through the skin. But in amniotes, we have more membranes, and these membranes are not as permeable to the diffusion of these gases. And so we have to be more specialized in order to breathe through them. Now, if you look at this chick embryo, you'll see that you have that amnion, which is that fluid that surrounds the chick, and that's where this word amniote comes from. You also have, for example, the yolk right there, that if you're familiar with eating eggs, you know exactly what that is. But the breathing membrane is known as the chorioallantois, which is this part that surrounds the embryo closer to the shell, basically. And if we take whatever is in this box right here of the chorioallantois and magnify it, we're looking at it so that this part is the shell and this part is the chorioallantoic membrane. And you can see first off that the chorioallantoic membrane is extremely vascular. And so it's serving as a respiratory membrane. The shell, surprisingly, and these are microscopic so you cannot see them, have pores which allow for the gases to be exchanged through that pore. And so oxygen can go into that pore and oxygenate the blood vessels that are in that chorioallantoic membrane. Now, if you travel to Europe, you'll find that when you go to a grocery store there, the eggs are not refrigerated and they're left out at room temperature. And then if you spend some time with a European family, you'll find out that they do not refrigerate their eggs. The reason why they do not refrigerate their eggs in European countries is because in the United States, as soon as we get the eggs, we wash them with soaps and water, and that starts to break down the cuticle that is a film that, again, you cannot really see unless you had a more powerful microscope. It starts breaking down that film and exposes the pores more easily to microbes, which can then enter through those pores and cause salmonella within the egg and cause bacterial growth. So in European countries, that washing of the egg is actually something that is illegal, and so they don't do it. And because of that, their eggshells are much more intact and much more antimicrobial. And so they can leave their eggs out at room temperature and not have to refrigerate them, and their eggs will not go bad. In the United States, you have to refrigerate your eggs or they will go bad. In B, we're looking at about 6 hours before hatching on day 19. The chick pokes through the inner shell membrane to push its beak into a small airspace within the egg. And this allows for its lungs to fill for the first time and to begin to participate along with the chorioallantois in breathing. So the chorioallantois is still going to be there for respiration, right? Because you cannot fill the lungs entirely with such a small airspace. But now we're starting to get the lungs to function. And they're going to start getting ready when the chick breaks through the shell a few hours later. Its lungs breathe atmospheric air and fill completely. The chorioallantois is going to shut down at that point, and the lungs will become the sole respiratory organs. We talked about the buccal pump being the primary way to get this current of air into and out of the lungs of fish and amphibians. So in anamniotes, the buccal pump is the most important pump. But in amniotes, what we see is that the buccal pump has a small role in getting the air in or out of the lungs. And instead, what we see is that we get this aspiration pump in which we are creating a pressure gradient around the lungs themselves inside the thoracic cavity. And really what we're talking about are diaphragmatic muscles. And so, being mammals, you're probably aware that you have a diaphragm, and this diaphragm sits below your lungs. And this diaphragm is a flat muscle that right below the lungs, it can either move upwards, and if it moves upwards, it'll force the air out. And of course, the buccal cavity will be there, but it will not be the major driving force of this aspiration pump. The major driving force will be in the thoracic cavity and the abdominal cavity, further down. When we want to inhalate, we want to bring that diaphragm down in order to decrease the pressure inside the thoracic cavity. And that's going to force the air to go through that buccal cavity all the way into the lungs and fill up our lungs. We start to see this powerful aspiration pump in reptiles. And in lizards, we don't have a diaphragm, which diaphragms work as pistons or like a muscle that goes up and down. But instead, what we have are the ribs and the muscles around the ribs that bring the ribs out or in. And when the ribs move outwards, then the thoracic cavity expands, the lung expands, and the air is forced to go into the lung. When these ribs move in because of muscle contractions, or sometimes it's a passive process and just require muscle relaxations, then the thoracic cavity gets smaller and the lungs compress, and this creates a higher pressure inside that thoracic cavity and is going to get the air to go out of the lungs. You may know that mammals, such as humans, have air sacs that have a dead end to them called alveoli. But in lizards, what we have are faveoli. And the difference between a faveolus and an alveolus is that faveoli are kind of like a honeycomb network, to where basically the lung allows for air to come into the center of the lung, and then the air just is going to permeate the entire lung, one faveolus at a time, and is going to go through all of them. And then within the faveoli, you'll have respiratory tissues of capillaries that can extract the oxygen from that air. We'll see that with mammals, with alveoli, instead of having a honeycomb structure, they have more like a structure that looks like grapes, and each alveolus is the grape, and there is a dead end, and so the air has to go into the alveolus, but then has to exit that same alveolus. When we look at reptiles that are very, very long and thin, such as in snakes, what we see is that the right lung becomes the dominant lung, and the left lung becomes rudimentary, very small, or sometimes disappears entirely. The right lung extends through most of the length of the body. And the anterior faveoli of the snake are going to be the ones that are more important for respiration, where gas exchange will take place. The posterior part of the lung, known as an air sac, will work as a bellows while the snake is eating. So let's think about it this way. When a snake is not eating, it can expand its rib cage outwards and allow for air to go in by changing the size of the thoracic cavity. So if we expand it outwards by bringing the ribs out, then air will go from a higher pressure outside the snake to a lower pressure inside the snake. But when the snake is eating and it's swallowing its prey whole, we often see that the body is too distended already, filled with the prey, to where it can no longer expand anymore. However, the snake still has to be able to breathe. And so what it's going to do is it's going to take the glottis and push the glottis out to the side as it is swallowing its prey. And the glottis will still be open and will still allow for air to go in through that tube and into the trachea. But how are we going to change the pressure inside the lung of the snake if we cannot expand the rib cage? The answer is that the posterior part can move like a piston back and forth and act as a bellows to change the pressure within the lung. And this saccular region is what takes over for the changing of pressure to still ventilate the lungs. Now in this case, we still have, because we are reptile, we still have these faveoli. And notice that there is no dead end to them. Air can go from one faveolus to the next. And that's what happens. Crocodiles have figured out a very unique way of breathing. What they have is, if you look at their anatomy, you'll see that right below the lung, you'll have the liver, and below the liver, you'll have diaphragmatic muscles that can control the position of the liver. And so this unique mechanism has allowed crocodiles to use the liver as a piston to where they can use diaphragmatic muscles to bring the liver more caudal and basically allow for that lung to expand in that thoracic cavity and decrease the pressure within it, allowing for that air to be forced to go into the lung. And so, like a piston, it will be working in a back and forth mechanism to either push the air out if the liver moves towards the head, or if the liver moves towards the tail, it will bring the air in. Birds have small lungs in comparison to mammals. And at first, this might be deceiving to where one might think that birds have a smaller respiratory apparatus than mammals. And if we think about how much oxygen birds need to fly, this would not make sense. And in fact, what we find is that beyond the lung, what birds have are these accessory air sacs, anteriorly, posteriorly, abdominal as well, and that these air sacs can also go into their bones, which allow for their bones to also serve as respiratory organs, but also to make their bones lighter to make flight more easy. The other thing that we notice with birds is that the airflow is going to be unidirectional, which makes it much more efficient than a bidirectional airflow. How is it possible that birds can have a unidirectional airflow We saw that with gills we could do it. With internal gills we could get the flow of water to go over the gills in one direction and not have to go back. But so far with lungs, we've seen that it's bidirectional because there's a dead end. But these air sacs are the key to understanding how a unidirectional flow can take place. And so basically what's going to happen is that the air is going to go through the trachea, is going to go to the posterior sacs, will then flow over the lung, flow to the anterior sacs, and then eventually get pushed out of the trachea again. The other thing that we have to keep in mind is that birds don't have a diaphragm, and they need to be able to change the size of their thoracic cavity in order to get airflow. And what they're going to do is they're going to use that sternum, that large sternal keel, and they're going to swing it forwards and backwards. And that swinging mechanism will be where their aspiration pump comes from. Also, they will have their ribs with uncinate processes, and the muscles that attach to these uncinate processes also are going to help with this swing and with the expansion of the ribs outwards and inwards. Let's look at how birds can achieve a unidirectional flow of air for respiration. We have to divide it into two cycles. You see cycle 1 on top, which has an inhalation 1 and an exhalation 1. And you see cycle 2 on the bottom, which has an inhalation 2 and an exhalation 2. And the way to follow this is to look at the dark gray as one type of volume of air and the light gray as a different volume of air. And the best way to track it is to just focus on the dark gray first and to see if you can follow the dark gray and see what it's doing. So let's start with inhalation 1. And with inhalation 1, as that thoracic cavity expands, we follow this dark gray air that goes into the trachea. And really, the most important thing is it fills those posterior air sacs and only begins to start going towards the lung itself. During exhalation 1, again following only this dark gray air because the light gray is a different volume of air, we see that the dark gray is going to get exhaled, not out of the bird yet, but rather from the posterior air sacs towards the lungs, and this is where most of that gas exchange will take place. During inhalation 2, again, just following the gray and the dark gray and not worrying about the light gray yet, what we see is that during inhalation 2, we're going to take that air that now is going to get pushed to the anterior air sacs. And so now most of that air is going to be in these anterior air sacs. And then during exhalation 2, that dark gray air will finally get exhaled out of the bird through the trachea. It will go from the anterior air sacs and out of the bird, and now we have completed that cycle for that dark gray band of air. And so realize that this is not tidal volume. Tidal volume is the volume that goes in, hits the wall, and goes out, but rather it is unidirectional in that it doesn't have to bounce back the way it came. It has a different path that it takes going in and a different path that it takes going out. Once you've been able to track the dark gray volume of air, then we can look at the light gray one and try to see what it does. But really, it's doing the exact same thing. It's just one cycle later. And so for the light gray, I like to start with inhalation 2 and follow it. So now I'm just focusing on the light gray. And I see that in inhalation 2, the air is going to flow into the trachea and go and fill those posterior air sacs and just the beginning of that lung right there. During exhalation 2, that air from those posterior air sacs will get pushed over most of that lung right there where that gas exchange is going to take place. During inhalation 1, we're going to take that air and push it into those anterior air sacs. And during exhalation 1, we're going to take that light gray air from those anterior air sacs and exhale it out through the trachea and out the bird. And so really what you see here are two volumes of air back to back, kind of making a assembly line type of breathing. But in both these volumes of air, one is following the other, and it's a unidirectional flow. Now what that does for the bird is during flight, with all of that oxygen that has to be used for energy production of all those flight muscles that have to work so hard, this makes it the most efficient mechanism of breathing for terrestrial vertebrates, to where this air never has to go back in a direction that it came into the bird. It will always circle in a unique way, both in and out of the bird. And that's why it's considered unidirectional. For mammals, what we're going to see is that the diaphragmatic muscle is the most important muscle for breathing. And we can look at a dog, for example, and look at its anatomy. And what we see is that you've got the lungs situated right there, and that diaphragm is right below. So let's compare this to the crocodile, which we've already looked at. With the crocodile, we saw that diaphragm was posterior to the liver. But in the mammal, it's anterior to the liver. Or you can think of it as in the crocodile, you've got the lungs, then you've got the liver, and then you've got the diaphragm muscle. In mammals, you've got the lung, you've got the diaphragm muscle, and you've got the liver after the diaphragm muscle. And that means that these diaphragmatic muscles are going to act directly on the lungs or on the pleura. However, let us not forget that we've retained also the ability to change our thoracic cavity size, not only with the flat diaphragm, but also with our rib cage. And so when you look at this picture down here, please note that the arrows that are pointing up on the left side are showing musculatures and bones that allow for that thoracic cavity to enlarge, either by bringing the ribs further apart from each other and outwards, or bringing the clavicle upwards. And on the right side, the arrows that point downwards are the ones that make the thoracic cavity smaller. And this would bring the ribs closer to each other and closer to the midline. They would bring your clavicle downwards. And notice also you would employ abdominal muscles as well, such as your rectus abdominis, to also get your abdomen working. And this is especially true in what we call active breathing or forced breathing, where, for example, you're having a fight or flight episode. And it's not just a passive process, but it's a very active process to push the air out in a forceful way. The muscles that are in between the ribs are known as intercostals, and these intercostals will manipulate the rib position either to flare them out or to bring them in. And then you've got several muscles in your throat area that can elevate the rib cage upwards. And so, for example, that sternocleidomastoid is a muscle that attaches to the sternum and goes all the way to the cranium and can elevate that part of the sternum upwards and increase the size of the thoracic cavity to inflate the lungs from the top. And then, of course, simultaneously, we should imagine that the diaphragm will be moving downwards to expand the lungs from the bottom. Simultaneously, the ribs will be moving outwards to expand the lungs side to side, and then the reverse would happen when we want to exhale. We often think of mammals as land-dwelling vertebrates. However, whales and dolphins are mammals that have colonized the waters and have become very successful in the water. And in fact, the sperm whale is the largest predator that is around on Earth, which kind of makes or should make you rather proud to be a mammal and to be somewhat related to a sperm whale. Now, the reason why it's called a sperm whale is because of this anatomical structure that it has on its nose called the spermaceti organ. And the spermaceti organ is filled with this unique lipid and collagen type fibers, this oily tissue that resembles sperm. And that's why it's called a spermaceti organ. Now, this organ is actually, and especially used to be, in very high demand and with very high value because of the large quantity of milky oil that you could get from it. And this milky oil could be used in lubricants. It could also be used as a type of oil that you could burn for energy. So, for example, you could make candles out of this spermaceti. And so not only was the blubber in very high value when it came to whale hunting, but also this spermaceti. And this spermaceti has been kind of mysterious for a while regarding what its purpose is. One view is that the spermaceti may be a buoyancy device, but more likely it's actually part of a sonar beam apparatus where it can focus the acoustics of the whale in order to use this sonic beam or sound beam in order to stun its prey before it goes and uses its jaws against it. Let's try to understand the anatomy by looking at the blowhole, which is the external nasal passage to basically allow this whale to breathe. And this is why whales will breach the surface of the water. And you can see that the air and that water vapor that condenses out as the air goes out, that is where they're breathing from, is from the blowhole. But there are two nasal passages within, and they are different. So the left nasal passage is specialized for breathing. It runs along the left side of the spermaceti organ to the superior internal nares. And we can follow it right here with that nasopalatine cavity starting and moving this way and all the way out to the blowhole. And so that's going to be the one that is for respiration. The right nasal passage instead is for sound production. So it starts right here and it moves into this front part of the nose called the vestibular sac. And from there, the nasal passage becomes this tube that goes between the spermaceti organ and below in this area is another big area called the junk, which is filled with fat tissue. And so going back to this right passage, it's going to move posteriorly and it's going to go between the spermaceti organ and the junk, and it's going to go into this posterior section. And this part back here is known as the frontal sac. These sonic beams are going to be generated and they will get bounced off between the vestibular sac and that frontal sac. And they will bounce off the frontal sac and then become very, very powerful before they basically get sent out towards the prey in order to shock the prey right before the attack takes place.